We've been talking about Advent. And so every week I've been bringing, or we've been showing pictures, if you've been with us, of what I find to be very entertaining Advent calendars. And I actually now have people sending me suggestions. I love it. Keep it going. And last week I had my Advent calendar for dog treats, and my dogs are loving them. They're very highly approved. The 55 grain-free treats are just winning, at our house. And I heard that Sam's Club reduced the price of the dog treat Advent calendar. If you've been waiting, now's your chance. But I found this one. If you have young children, maybe girls, maybe boys, they're in the Frozen 2. The 12 Days of Christmas Frozen 2 Advent Calendar by Smackers. Anybody got one of these? They're going through their house, opening the little doors. None of you guys will admit that, will you? All right, that's okay. Inside of here, if you don't know what Smackers is, you're gonna find lip gloss and nail polish. all the things to make you look beautiful. And you can get one of those. That's Advent Calendar right there from Disney. Thank you. Here's the one I want. If you're gonna buy me a gift, get me this. Anybody have this one? This is awesome. So the Fortnite Advent Calendar, if you don't know what Fortnite is, actually this service should know what Fortnite is mostly. The last three, no chance. And so there's, this is an online game. You kill people, you come back, they kill you, more people. It's very virtuous and wholesome, I promise. But you have different characters and things you wear in the game, and you can find 24 of them inside those little Christmas doors. It's beautiful, wonderful. And by the way, did anyone watch the Star Wars event on Fortnite Live yesterday? Just please be proud. And no? The whole weekend, me and one other guy watched it. It was awesome. So if you like Fortnite or Star Wars, go catch up on YouTube. It was really cool. I was explaining it to some fifth graders between services, and we all agree it was awesome. So you should too. But anyway, that's not Advent. That's okay. Like, these things aren't bad. My Advent dog treat calendar, whatever it is you do. Like, those things are great, but they're not Advent. We're just putting Advent on the name of something so we can sell more of it. But here's what Advent is. Here's where we've been starting every time this month. Advent's a Latin word. It's really straightforward. It means the coming or the second coming of Christ. It's just this celebration that centuries ago, followers of Jesus said, we need to focus on that Jesus came. We need this month leading up to Christmas to put our hearts and our minds towards what is really going on at Christmas. And we've been saying that the message of Advent is this. The message is that the separation between God and us is over. And so we've been looking at, because of those things, because Christ has come, because the separation between God and you, the separation between God and me, it's over. And so we've been looking at these different places. And that's what these panels on the wall and on the screen represent. They represent these different places that Christ comes into. He comes to us in the valleys. David called it the valley of the shadow of death. And when we experience that in our life, we know Christ is there because of Advent, because of Christmas. He's in the garden. That's what we talked about last week. And the garden is the cultivated place that God makes for us to interact with him. And this wonderful picture all throughout Scripture, all the different places that we see God and mankind in a garden. And the garden represents life the way it should be. And even when life is at its best, God is there with you. Christ is with you. Today we're going to talk about that Christ is in the storm. Next week, so excited, Garrett's going to talk about that Christ is here always. He's always with us through the Holy Spirit and this understanding that, yes, Jesus physically left the earth, but he didn't leave us behind. He walks with us in the daily things that we deal with, even now. But Christ in the storm, what does that mean? What are storms in our life? Storms are just simply this. They're the unexpected things of life. Sometimes life brings us all something we're not expecting. I think back to several years ago, a few years ago, in our family, we had a small storm. And some of our storms are small. Some of them are really large and devastating. They're tragic. We had this season where our washing machine quit working, and there's 5 people living in our house, and at the time, 2.5 of them were teenagers, and lots of people in my house, I think, wear clothes for an hour, and then they change clothes and wash them. We have just more laundry than a small country does. And you know this when your washing machine doesn't work, right? Because it just piles up, and you can't see anywhere, You're just like, what is happening? So we got that fixed, and then the dryer decides to quit working just soon after that, like a week later, and you're like, how do they know this? Do they communicate? Then it wasn't long after we got them repaired, they both just stopped. It's like, okay, we're done with this. We bought some new ones, and we got the laundry thing caught up. It takes like 6 months, and it was just a few weeks after the laundry thing got caught up that our dishwasher broke. I was like, well, this is why we had children. You have to wash dishes now, kids. Sorry about the modern conveniences breaking in life. But we got our dishwasher replaced and installed, and it's a minor storm, right? But all this stuff happened just in a short period of time. But those things cause stress. They cost money. Nobody was giving us a free stuff. It's the unexpected things of life. Whether it's a financial problem that's small to medium like that one, or big, maybe it's a loss of a loved one. Storms are tragic sometimes. You could be in a car accident, your job gets changed, you didn't want it to change. Life will bring you storms, right? Like, I don't have to convince you that, right? We all are gonna have storms. Some are small, some are not small. Are you prepared for the storm that's coming next in your life? Some of us take preparation very seriously. Like, some of us buy things like this, right? Do you ever buy like a survival emergency kit, or just put one together? Like, some of you are so smart, you're like, I'm not paying for that online. I'll just go buy glow sticks by myself, packets of water, and I don't even know what all is in this thing. I see a flashlight and a mask and candles. That makes sense, right? Are you prepared for the storms in life? Have you ever lived in a place that gets hurricanes? Well, no, because you're smart. You would never live there. Right? If you live in a place where it's hurricanes and it's hurricane season, you should be prepared at some level. Are you prepared for the next 4-foot snowstorm? Like, 4 of us are. The rest of us will be at Walmart the night before buying everything we might need when we're snowed in. I grew up in Oklahoma. You know how you prepare for tornado season? You just pray. God, I hope I'm right with you, because if it hits my house, I'm coming to see you. Right? You can't beat a tornado. You just get lucky. Or you don't. The rest of life, is it any different? Are you prepared for the storm at Christmas dinner? You know it's coming. You have a relative who's going to bring out politics at Christmas dinner. Or maybe they're going to be super polite and wait till the pie round. And then they bring up religion too. And you're just going to be like, great, here we go again. The storm is brewing. It will happen. And then there's the spiritual storms. You ever experienced a spiritual storm? We have to be prepared for real storms, physical storms, and, weird uncles at Christmas storms. Those are all the small things. If you've ever been in a spiritual storm, and I think most of us have at some point, you know that it's just hard. I found myself many years ago in a season that after a close member of our family did something that was incredibly harmful to another member of our family, I spent months, literally several months, just asking questions in this spiritual storm. These events I had no idea they were going to happen. I didn't see it coming. I asked questions like, God, why didn't you protect our family from this abuse? It's hard to admit. And I haven't talked about it for a long time, but now, many years later, I'm able to realize that I even asked God, I even said things to God like, God, don't you see all the things I'm doing for you? As if that was going to keep the storms away. Like that was some sort of like barter that we had agreed to, but the spiritual storm I found myself in was real. I was very fearful. It's scary to be in that place asking questions like that. And even I found for me, even more frightening was that I knew all the answers to the questions. I'd sat across the table at a restaurant over a cup of coffee with people who'd been through storms, or in an office or a counseling room, and I'd given the answer to the exact same questions to people in similar or even worse situations that I was experiencing. But I couldn't stop asking those questions for a season. Maybe you can relate. Maybe you're in that season. Maybe it's in your rearview mirror like mine is. Maybe it's coming soon. But here's the good news, the great news. Jesus tells us how to survive a storm. It's really straightforward. Matthew, one of his followers, one of the people standing there when he starts teaching what's called the Sermon on the Mount, this series of conversations and lessons. And towards the end of this Matthew, in his biography of Jesus, from his own accounts of being there, he writes this from Jesus. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine puts them into practice like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against the house. You know what that means, right? Do I have to connect this dot for you? Rain, streams, wind, storm. Jesus is saying, when the storm comes, this person's house, it did not fall because it had its foundation on a rock, on the rock. But then look, it keeps going. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose up, the wind blew, beat against the house. It's the same storm. It's not a worse storm from the first person. It's the same one. And it fell with a great crash. Jesus shows us how to survive a storm. It was in the very first verse we read. Look, here's the words that Jesus is saying. That God speaks and puts them into, what's it say? Everybody say practice. Now everybody else say practice. There you go. I love that word. You know what I love about practice? Practice doesn't have to be perfect. Practice isn't, I got it all figured out. I know everything and I'm going to, practice isn't ever very often impressive. Puts it into practice. What Jesus says is that you'll have a storm. And what happens when it comes depends on what you did before it came. Did you hear what Jesus has said and put it into practice in your life? Not being perfect, not having all the answers, not understanding all the deep things of doctrine and theology. That's not part of what he said. Listen to what he says and try to live it out. And when the storm comes, it will still be painful. You'll still ask the questions, but your house will stand. Solomon, the wisest person who ever lived in a collection of writings in ancient Hebrew literature called Proverbs, says it this way. He says, when the storm has swept by, the wicked are gone, but the righteous stand firm forever. Now here's what I want you to understand about Proverbs. This writing is very unique. He's not describing virtuous people and wicked people the way you and I think of them. This whole book, this whole writing of Proverbs, all this poetry, righteousness is described by one trait: doing what God says. That's what makes someone righteous. Wickedness is not someone who kills puppies and enjoys it, right? Like heinous, wicked things we could think of. Like that's not how Proverbs describes wickedness. He describes wickedness as people who are foolish, who hear what God say, they know wisdom, but they choose folly. That makes a person wicked. He says the difference between the wicked and the righteous, Jesus said it listening to his words and doing them. How to survive a storm. Do you want to be swept away by the next storm? I don't. And I know you don't. So let's look at Joseph. We're here at Christmas. It's Advent. You're getting cards in the mail from people. I'm getting cards in the mail from people. You're seeing all the imagery. Joseph's in all the pictures. He's not a major player, right? Mary, shepherds, Jesus. But Joseph's there. And Joseph, Jesus' father on earth, I believe is a great example of storm management. Now, here's what I mean. Maybe you know the story of Joseph. Maybe you don't. Joseph is pledged to be married to a young gal in his community. Nazareth is a village of 200, 250 people max. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows Joseph and Mary are going to be married, and they're engaged. And she comes up to Joseph one day and says, I need to tell you something. I'm pregnant. Unexpected storm, if you're Joseph, right? Joseph has not slept with Mary. So he understands how this works. And he understands he didn't do that. And that somebody did. And now Mary starts talking about God came to her, or this angel came, and there's this vision, and then this is a supernatural thing, and her baby is Messiah. And Joseph, I'm sure, it's not in the text, this is just my opinion, looked at her and said, Mary, you ate the wrong mushrooms. Like, you're not supposed to eat those mushrooms from that part by the river, like over here are the safe ones. Like, what's wrong with you, woman? Like, this doesn't happen. I haven't done this. Who did this? And he decides to do the right thing. Instead of having her prosecuted for religious crime, instead of making a big deal, he's going to do it quietly. He makes this righteous decision. And then God comes to him through an angel in his own vision and says, don't do that. This is what's going on, Joseph, and tells him what's happening. You can read it. It's right there in the biographies of Jesus. He has this vision that this is a supernatural child of God, and asking him to raise this child as his own. This guy's asked to raise someone else's child. Some of you do that. Some of you have experienced that, whether it's a stepchild or you've gotten involved in foster care. And some of you said, I don't want that to be temporary in foster care. I want this to be permanent. And you adopt children that are not your own. It's amazing. You're my heroes, honestly. Joseph is one of these people. Now his pregnant wife or not his wife, and everyone in town knows she's pregnant, and that before the wedding, it's scandalous. Way more scandalous than it would be in any time in our culture. Now he has to go to Bethlehem. He gets orders from the government for a census. Another storm. Like, how do you get a pregnant lady from Nazareth to Bethlehem? Maybe a donkey, we don't know. They get down there. It's just not ideal. They can't find a proper place for his wife to give birth to a son. Those of us who are wired to be providers, protectors, have you ever thought about Joseph in this? He shows up to Bethlehem, another storm. You can't find a place to stay. It was full, but you're also talking about scandalous couple who haven't done things God's way. Make their house unclean if you invite them into it because they're not married and she's obviously pregnant. The storm that Joseph's facing. We see that Jesus was born, and that's what's on all the cards and the celebration, and it's awesome. And then the next thing we see is Joseph, a week later, a few days later, in the temple with Jesus and Mary, and they're providing a sacrifice to dedicate this child to God. The law said the firstborn male would be redeemed, would be the sacrifice would be given to God for this child's life and to celebrate it. And what's interesting is we think everybody did this all the time, but friends, it's just like life now. Some people did the right things and some people didn't. Joseph decides to do the right thing, and here's what's interesting. Joseph comes to the temple with a poor person sacrifice. It says it right there in the biographies. He doesn't bring a lamb. That's the prescribed price. And that's not expensive. That's within reach of most people. But God in his law had said, if you don't have that, then you can either bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons. I mean, if you're so poor that you can't afford it, you can just catch pigeons if you try long enough. So Joseph shows up with 2 birds. A person in poverty's sacrifice for God's child, his stepson. I wonder if Joseph was waiting for the child support payments to start rolling in. Hey God, I'm going to raise your son. I'm broke. I mean, Joseph is broke. That's why he gave 2 birds. But he still did it. And he went to the temple, and he does that. Oh, I know, some of you are thinking ahead. You're like, well, what about the wise men and that big old bounty of Christmas gifts? Friends, go back and read it. The wise men, the magi come and with incredibly valuable gifts 2 years after Joseph goes to the temple. 2 years, Joseph is paying for God's son. God, the owner of everything, is not making any payments. And Joseph is working and has not even enough money to go back home. That's why they're still in Bethlehem, because he's broke, raising God's son, taking on a wife. And then God provides through the wise men, yes, gold and frankincense and myrrh, so that not they can go home, so they can run to Egypt to avoid their son being murdered. Another storm. See why Joseph is the perfect person to talk about when life goes unexpectedly? Because your life's going to go unexpectedly. Joseph's did for sure. And in every storm, Joseph obeyed. He did the next right thing. And I see it in my life, and I see it in so many of our lives, that we don't take the next step of obedience, whatever it is, however big or small, because we want to see where it leads. We want to see the end of the journey, and God often just shows you one step. We know that Joseph had some idea what was happening through what God had told him, but he didn't know where this next step was going to go. He didn't see the end. He always obeyed. What is the next step of obedience for you and I? You and I can learn so much from Joseph this Advent. Here's some things Joseph did that I believe if you and I could put them in our life, in our heart and soul, they would serve us so well. Really every day, but especially the day the storms come. Here they are. Joseph listened well. He listened well. Every time we see him in these accounts, he's hearing from God. And he's doing what God's asked him to do. He's listening well. And for you and I, that comes when we spend time in prayer. We can find practices like solitude, which is the most countercultural thing right now in our world. To just be alone and be quiet. And you might be only able to do it for a few minutes or an hour. Seeking wise counsel from other people. It's how we listen well. I will tell you this, if you want to learn in these practices of listening well, I can recommend no better place to you than what our church experiences often. It's called Rooted. It's 10 weeks. It's a high-level commitment. And many of the conversations that happen there, many of the lessons and the materials go through how does God speak to you? How do you listen? Oh, and who are a group of people that walk this with you? It starts again February 2nd. You can get the information, but some of us need help in listening well. It's not another thing to add to your life. It's something you need to seek God, to slow down. As we talked about the garden last week, the garden it is a cultivated space. It takes a little effort to make a garden. And for many of us, it's time to cultivate, to make effort to listen to God. That's what Joseph did. Maybe that would serve us. The second thing he did that we see is he trusted. He trusted God. Can you imagine the things that he had to decide upon? Virgins having babies and angels coming to speak to him and fleeing King Herod and all these things. How would you deal with that? Even in the ancient world, the things we know the end of the story. He didn't, but he trusted. Last week I talked about the question really in the garden is who defines good and who defines bad? Do you and I? Or do we trust God? In the garden is where you have to make that decision. And in the garden, if God says this is good and this is bad, and we follow that, we trust that, we stay with him in the garden. That's what Joseph's showing. He let God decide what was good and what was bad, but we get caught up in going, no, God, you can decide those areas, but over here, I decide what's good. I decide what's bad, because God, you don't really know what's going on. Joseph trusts. He always picks the side of trust, even when it doesn't make any sense. The math doesn't seem to add up, but are you going to step into trust? He knew that God was more informed than him. And some of us don't believe that. We think we know more than God. Where can you and I trust more? Third and lastly, Joseph obeyed quickly. Anybody who's had children or been around children or heard of children, you know the difference, right? You ask a child to do something and they obey quickly, or they obey after you count to 3, or you take away their phone these days, or, right? Like there's like drag your feet obedience, kicking and screaming sometimes, or just delay, like, oh, I forgot. And I do that too. Joseph, what I love about the pieces, just the snippets we get into his life, and they're just snippets. He obeys quickly. God says, do this. He gets up and he does it. I think it's a lesson we can learn. See, nothing will get your attention like the next major Category 5 storm that comes into your life. Right? It gets all of our attention. But should you really wait until one comes? Because what will happen when that comes spiritually, you'll start obeying quickly. You will. What if you started obeying quickly now? before the next one comes? What if you were to take the words of Jesus, like he said in Matthew 7, and put them into practice? What if you did it ahead of time? I don't believe that Joseph's obedience, his trust, his listening began when Mary showed up pregnant. I really think it started way back in his life at some point. This Advent season, for you and I to survive the spiritual storms that are going to come into our life, small or large, the practices we see in Joseph, could they help us be more prepared? Could we start to listen well, trust more, and obey quickly? I believe if we use this Christmas season to do those things, to learn from Joseph, we will see more and more that Jesus is truly with us in the storms. Would you pray with me? God, we are so grateful that you came to us and that the separation between us and you is over. Jesus, would you show us how to listen well? Would you help us to trust more and to obey quickly, so that in the good days of life, but in the storms as well, we can sense your presence. We're so grateful for Christmas and this Advent season to put our focus and to celebrate so many great things, but especially your coming. Help us, Christ, even in the storms, to honor you. In Jesus, your holy and precious name, we pray this.